Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Non, shalom, and welcome to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. I hope you guys can hear me loud and clear. I am, of course, coming to you from my cousin's place again. Shout out to my cousin who proudly, by the way, has, for tonight's show, has sponsored tonight's internet feed. He is actually in the internet space. His company is called Plug Point. Plug Point. I'll put those details in the descriptor a bit later. He's a small-time entrepreneur. Please support him. He's doing fantastic work. An absolute innovator. Siyabonga Sibia. Shout out to you, my wonderful, beautiful cousin. I love seeing family doing well and starting small businesses. Speaking about small businesses, that's what tonight is all about. It's about small business and all things SMME. As we answer the question and really ask the question rather, you know, is government an impediment to SMMEs in this country? Are the politicians in particular a great impediment to the entrepreneur in our society? So that's the question we're going to be asking tonight. I have a jam-packed show. My guest for this evening, Vusi Thembekwayo, will be joining us at about 8:20 tonight. Before that, I want to play a segment, a short insert that I recorded, excuse me, during the course of the week, and the weekend rather, with a young entrepreneur, someone who I've taken up the issue on behalf of to a large extent, or to a small extent rather. He's known on social media as @SandwichKing. And I'm going to bring you his story tonight, as I think he typifies the South African entrepreneur at the moment, the South African SMME at the moment, fighting not only for the survival of his business in these times of COVID-19 and specifically the lockdown, which is, as I've said before on a vlog, the lockdown and the economic misery we find ourselves in is 100% caused by politicians. It is 100% caused by government. This idea that it is COVID-19 that is destroying the economy is absolute poppycock. A lot of the economic harm, the millions of South Africans finding themselves on the brink of having no income, many finding themselves at the point of even starvation, is 100% caused by politicians. And we're going to have that conversation tonight, and I'm going to bring you this special insert by, produced by me, I suppose. Hopefully in the near future, when my funds grow, I'll be able to hire some guys who can also help compile stories in wherever they are in the world. But hey, that's me prophesying in the future, hopefully, if things come together. Speaking about hope and making those things come together, remember, guys, you can support the Big Daddy Liberty Show. You can support your favorite fat boy, BDL, as I prosecute the liberty-leaning ideas in communities in this country. Remember, I've told you that the vast majority of what I want my work to be is me taking these ideas and putting it in your community. So to do that, I'll be taking to the country, by the looks of it, there's a little bit of bad news on that front, but we'll get to that a bit later at the end of the show. But I will be taking to the country in order to bring these ideas into communities around South Africa. So please look out for that as I continue to put that together. And you can support me in my endeavors by becoming a donator of the show, as little as $1 a month, as little as 17 Rand a month, goes a long way in towards putting this work together. And you can do that, of course, by finding me on Patreon. And of course, I will add other ways to donate to the show. So that link is in the description as to how you can join the over 180, I think now, South Africans who have literally said, hey, BDL, we're going to help crowdfund this mission. We're going to jump on the Liberty bus and back you in your mission. And you can do that, of course, as I said, by donating as little as $1 a month via Patreon. And I will introduce other ways. Okay, guys. Let's get to the show. As I said, that my guest, I'll bring him on at 20 past. I do want you to watch the segment that was compiled by me over the weekend and during the week, where I interviewed Itumeleng, the Sandwich King, and asked him exactly how has the lockdown treated him, and more importantly, why is it that the greatest impediment to his business, to his flourishing, is not, the economy and fundamentals and finances like any other business should face as a challenge. A welcome challenge, if anything, but rather that the greatest impediment he has to doing business has been government and politicians. Politicians who sick, almost like a rabid dog, a rabid attack dog, their police force onto street traders, even though the street traders have done everything right. That is, they've run the bureaucratic gauntlet that is often required of them in order to then trade, hopefully freely on the streets, but they aren't. Why? Because Johnny Lawman, Captain Bacon and Officer Ham are literally around every corner waiting to pounce on entrepreneurs in the street. People, ordinary South Africans who are trying to make an honest day living, and it is those people who they're confiscating stock of, who they're trying to solicit bribes from. And even in the segment that I'm going to play you now, a video that he shared, you can actually kind of hear the officer, sort of hinting at the language of, hey man, if you don't want us pouncing on you, how about you make a special arrangement, he says. But I'll let you listen to that in the short segment that I'm going to play to you now. It's about 9 minutes long, and after that, we cross straight to our guest, Vusi Thembekwayo, and I'll establish that link with him. Let me just remind you that he was supposed to be on the show on Sunday, but he had an emergency, but I've just spoken to him and went across to him at 9:20. Guys, I'll see you after the short segment.
Relax, child. Mfethu, kuba stock sakhe athenze. Mfethu, kuba stock sakhe. Kuba stock sakhe. Kuba stock sakhe, guys. Please. Dale kuba. Kuba sleep. But guys.
That's what it's like SARS. When I behave, wasn't to like everything.
I know. You must touch everything. Yeah.
If ever I'm told you like you shall share before that, die and there, and it's a ski sense of land.
Angibona usisters wafika nje wathela
kumele nawe ungamraseli because unothule uzwakale kuye esayidini umdonso sisiteli singenza ukubangela kanjani we out ukufuna ushare
mfethu
come on bro
kupa stock saka guys like every day dona that stock saka every day sankiwa chenzayi but no mfethu sizama impilo ngayi mfethu manje senze njani
impilo nayo sesifanini sakhe ukuthatha lezi zinto lezi.
Hey guys, Big Daddy Liberty here. I'm in conversation, as I've been saying for quite a while, with Utumeleng Lekumenyano, better known as the Sandwich King, and you can follow him on social media. But I hate to say this, we're going to have a conversation not on the things I like talking about, which is young entrepreneurs doing really well, although he is doing well, but the conversation we're going to have today is about who stands in the way of the young entrepreneur in South Africa? Who stands in the way of the innovator, the creator, the doer, the one who actually generates money in our economy? Because politicians, as I always say, don't generate squat. But Itu's story is a painful one, and I'm going to let him tell it. But essentially, here's a young man tried to put together a small business, trading on the street, selling sandwiches and all the sort of things that you and I need when we're having lunch at work. But it's government and really JMPD, that's the Metro Police here in Johannesburg, who gets in his way. And it's gotten to a point where it's flat out harassment now by the state. So I want to have a chat with Itu. He can tell us exactly what's going on, what the challenges are, and we'll put this issue to JMPD if they're actually willing to have a chat with us. But Itu, welcome to the Big Daddy Liberty Show, brother. You and I have been chatting on social media for quite a while, and I've expressed, I don't know how to put it without losing my mind here and now, but outrage at the harassment that you're experiencing from the local government here in Johannesburg, Umaspala and the JMPD.
Yeah.
Talk to me. Firstly, what do you do for a living, and how did you come about becoming an entrepreneur?
Okay, so basically, I'm Itumelele Kumanyane, the Sandwich King, as you've said. I sell sandwiches on the streets of Joburg. So I started selling sandwiches last year in August just to make income for myself because I was unemployed. I didn't have anything to do. I was depressed. So much was going on in my life. So I decided, let me start doing this, And then as I was going, in this whole process, I started creating employment for other youths out there. So currently, I employ like 4 youths that are working with me in other stations. They also having the same issues I'm experiencing every day. And then we've also have issues with the government and the JMPD who keeps harassing us and taking our stock on it every single day, if not every second or third day, so every day it's just a constant struggle having to run away from the JMPD. If we don't run away, they catch us and then they take the stock from us with no explanation, not willing to tell us the reasons why they're taking our stock, or maybe telling us what we can do to actually trade better and be in a proper relationship with them.
And that last point you're making is such an important point because, in a functional society, that creates opportunity for people, the government is supposed to play the role of, basically making sure that, it enforces bylaws but does so fairly. And on the issue of fairness, they're supposed to tell you guys, look, here are the rules. If you follow the rules, nothing happens. You, in the last post you did, you actually even showed on social media that you played by the rules. You have a permit, and yet the Metro Police still come and confiscate your goods. What reason do they cite when they take your stuff?
So I don't know. I showed them my permit, and then the reason I got was So like that is like the basic language we used to hear every day on the streets. The harassment, the fighting. So like I showed them my permit. So my permit, they say they don't wanna say it. So I don't know what must we do as street vendors, as small businesses, in order for us to trade better in our streets, because so many other people are trading here in the streets, but they have no problems with them. But me, I don't know. Is it me as an individual who's a target, or I don't know? But like this is very heartbreaking to me. I've fought and fought and fought, but I just don't seem to be winning.
Maybe in my last 2 questions, because as I said, and on this show, I talk a lot about who I stand for as Big Daddy. I stand for faith, flag, families, and freedom. All of these things that you as an individual should, they're a God-given right of yours in order for you to provide for your family. And that's what I want to talk about here. I want to contextualize this. You're not just doing this for fun. You have a family that you're looking for, out for.
Yes. Basically, I'm looking out for my daughter, and I've got my little brother as well, and also my mom. So basically, everyone kind of depends on me, and I have to pay maintenance. There's also these basic living expenses of like adulting in South Africa. There's rent, there's groceries. How am I supposed to make a living if I can come make opportunities for myself? And if ever making opportunities by myself, then I'm forever dragged down or crushed by the government. I will not go anywhere. I will not contribute to the economy as I'm supposed to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But thank you for your time. Let me maybe wrap it up by saying, from my side and the show side, I'm going to take this fight up. I didn't tell you this before we went on air, but I'm going to speak to some friends, see what we can do, because I think there's a big fight here, not necessarily with you as an individual, but with street traders. I mean, we're standing in front of a lady here who sells, and for a lot of people, this is how they make an income, especially under what was the lockdown, where you guys weren't trading. Maybe as a final question, how has the lockdown, how did it treat you? Was it a help to you, or was it what happened? Tell me about your experience under the lockdown.
The lockdown really destroyed our business. The lockdown really made us spend all the money we had saved up for the business, because we depend on a daily income. We were out of business for over 40 to 50 days, so we didn't have income for all those days. So all our savings had to be used up. We have employees. I live with my employees. I have people I have to take care of. As you were saying, also in regards to family, I also have the employees. I gave them their own place. They live there, so they cannot have transport constraints in coming to work in the mornings, because we have to be in our stations by 5 a.m. But the lockdown really showed us how the system is towards like entrepreneurs, because like even today we haven't gotten any, what is this, they call it compensation.
Yeah.
Yes, the compensation. So we've been applying for it. We applied for the NYDA one, we applied for the, yes, for the grants, and then we applied for also the one for the government. Still, we haven't even gotten feedback on whether our applications were successful or not. But the same people are the same people who are going to be fighting us every single day when we're trying to make a living.
I hate to say it, but it's true.
Yeah.
Maybe as a final question, and it's a little bit of a sideways question, but
Yeah.
I'll let you deal with it. In your view, in a single sentence, do you think are politicians a help or a hindrance to the young entrepreneur in this country?
They're a hindrance. They're watching out for their own. They're watching their own pockets. They do not care what's happening. They do not care whether a person in South Africa goes to bed hungry. They do not care whether we are making a living or not. It's just all about them, how they're living in their big mansions right now, under lockdown. Someone is under lockdown in Soweto, where they can be indoors, well, they have everything comfortable for them.
And that's the sad truth. Buti, last second or so, how do the people reach you on your social media?
Okay. On Twitter, I'm at Sandwich King. On Facebook, I'm Itumeleng, Sandwich King Likomanyane. And on Instagram, I'm at Sandwich King.
Hey, Tara, I'll put those details on the screen. Buti, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And again, you heard it from the man himself. Politicians are a hindrance. They're not helping young entrepreneurs. They're not helping the people that you can see around here who are trying to make a living. And there's a big difference between the political elite in this country and the ordinary citizen who's looking after family and children. That is something I'm going to put to JMPD directly, and let's see if they're willing to have that conversation with me. Yeah, there you have it, guys. Again, you've heard it from the horse's mouth. Yeah, guys, I'm going to put you on hold for just a second as I'm struggling to get a hold of Vusi. I mean, I just spoke to him just before the show, so I'm not entirely sure why I can't get a hold of him, but there's a few interesting takeaways from this conversation that I had with Itumeleng, and you can hear whenever he speaks about the Johannesburg Metro Police, you can hear just how exasperated he is in his voice. As how do you trade like this? Like how do you build something? I mean, I'm talking to you now as fellow South Africans. How do we build a nation? How do we build a prosperous, non-racial, free market leaning, property-owning society when you literally have, a gaggle of politicians in the state who just don't see the value of according individuals, according families, freedom in this economy for them, for you, the ordinary person, to be the one who builds the income, who builds the enterprise. And from an enterprise, or from even just getting a job, building an income. From an income, being able to build household savings. And it's from those household savings that you're able to buy a better quality of life. It is quite patently clear when you listen to entrepreneurs across the country, and I'm really hoping we can get Vusi on the show because he can add such greater depth and context to this. As I was saying, it's my hope that it will be those individuals in a society who are the ones who generate the wealth. Because politicians don't generate, as I said in the video, they don't generate jack fiddly squat. Politicians are the leeches of society. And I'm not picking my favorite politicians versus the ones that aren't. Like all politicians in my book, as you've seen on my social media feed, hashtag politicians are trash. I say that because there's a recognition on my side, at least, an aha moment on my side that it is you, the individual, it is families that are best placed to make decisions about the course of their own lives, including how they can pursue as individuals their own separate interests in a market economy to generate wealth, to generate income. It is only when you allow the millions of individuals in a society for them to each pursue their own separate interests that is when you find that you develop a market that thrives, that generates wealth, that generates a diverse set of products, goods, and services. Politicians cannot do this from some centrally planned authority. No politician sitting in Pretoria or the Western Cape or KZN or Gauteng, no politician can centrally organize a society to create the sort of diversity and the sort of free enterprise and the sort of wealth that is unleashed when you allow individuals to create the wealth in society. Let me be precise and specific and use this lockdown as a good example. Over this lockdown, notice how many things in your life right now, which used to be relatively free for you to do because someone in the market provided, notice how many of those things are now less free or more cumbersome to do because a politician got in the way. Don't worry, I'll wait. Because I really want you to think about just how cumbersome your life has become. I mean, just over the, sorry, I've just lost track of the days. So it's Wednesday today. On Monday, I was flying a friend down back to Durban, who was doing a little bit of work, basically helped me put together that insert. I was flying them back to Durban, and, suddenly to fly in this country, you need to fill in a health form, which in and of itself is about a 2-pager with all sorts of questions on there. You need to then bring a 2 or was it 3 copies of that when you get to the airport. When you get to the airport, there's police who are manning, the doors. Guys, it's an absolute mess. And we're allowing this because politicians in this country generally see themselves as royalty. Here we go. So Vusi has just contacted me on my line. So let me just quickly establish that. And after the short intermission, we'll have Vusi Thembekwayo live here on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. All right, guys, I have Vusi on the line. Busy businessman, you know how it is. The homie had some stuff to do. Vusi, welcome to the show. You're now live on the Big Daddy Liberty Show, brother. I'm so excited to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Vusi, let's jump straight into it because, our conversation only is about 30 minutes or so. I've just finished flighting a segment, Vusi, with a young man who you may actually be aware of on social media. He goes by @sandwich_king, the Sandwich King. Here's a young man, entrepreneur. His long story just condensed in a sentence. Here's a guy, lost his job. It was the last 800 rands between him and poverty. Instead of wallowing in his situation of not finding another job, he said, stuff it. How about I do something, start something? And he's built this business now that is putting together some serious revenue for him, allowing him to look after his family. But the biggest impediment, according to him in the interview, hasn't been, the fundamentals of growing his business. It's been the state. It's been, in this case, JMPD, who constantly harasses him, constantly confiscates his stock, even though he's done the right thing. So the government, as you know, says, run this bureaucratic gauntlet, do this, do that, get this permit, and then you can trade. But in his case, he's done all of this, but it's still the state that gets in his way. Does this not speak to some of the points you were making in that viral video about the government and politicians really being an impediment to the SMME and really the entrepreneur in this country?
It does, right? And I am very well aware of it. One, because I saw his video and I then reached out to the necessary authorities and I said, guys, this is not acceptable. And as is the lethargy of the state, even though I had done so, I've heard nothing today. So I take it, that is whatever it is. That's precisely the problem. He is a symbol, I suppose, of what is a much more complex and far deeper, much more insidious problem than originally thought. And the problem is that it's not only just about allowing people the space to trade, but also making sure that the best people get given the opportunities that they deserve. And that's exactly what the issue is.
I'd agree with you. And again, it comes back to some of the fundamentals around what is your objective in building a free, property-owning, market-orientated and non-racial society? Like, is that really the goal? Or are you trying to build, is there some other agenda that we're seeing from the political elites in this country? Because Vusi, and I want to put this to you, there seems to be a massive divide in this country between what is a growing elite, a growing political elite, and the ordinary individual who just wants the opportunity to be able to pursue, an idea, build a business, and then make an income, make some savings. There does seem to be a distinct divide between those two groupings. What is your sense around what's happening between that divide, between the political elite, if you will, and the ordinary individual looking to become an entrepreneur?
It's I couldn't have said it any better. When people were talking about the South Africa's levels of inequality expressed in the Gini coefficient, the conversation was academic, but actually those who live it in the real world understood it. And I think it's becoming, increasingly so now. So South Africa's always had issues of inequality, right? And it's a function of where we come from. There was a time people like you and I simply would not have been allowed to even have a platform like this or have these conversations. And so that created an inequality that was race-based. And we came into the new dispensation. And now we have an inequality that's class-based. And it seems to be deepening. And I get the sense that there are some people who are trying to make sure that they're in the upper echelons of class, regardless of how they get there. And so the ends justifies the means, which is a part of the reason why you begin to see the levels of delinquency that you see, the levels of corruptions that you see, and all these other social ills that we suffer. I am heartened, I must tell you, my brother, a part of me is actually heartened that we're beginning to see people saying enough is enough. Because the thing is, then it means that the system is not sustainable. And any system that excludes a majority, sooner or later, that majority will topple it. Sooner or later. It takes a while, it might take a decade, might take 5, might take a century. But sooner or later, people will go, it's enough now, we've had enough. And I think that what coronavirus has done is it has accelerated people's expression of that. So you're seeing young people go, this economy that you've been building doesn't include me because I'm young. You told me go to school and get an education. I did so, but there are no jobs. You're seeing middle class people go, this financial system doesn't work for me because even though I'm middle class by consumption, not by assets. And because our rand is depreciating, I'm getting progressively poorer on the asset base anyway. And so all South Africans are now looking and going, who is this thing for? And it persists and sustains itself only for those who sit at the upper echelons, who get to look down at the citizens and go, this is exactly what we wanted. It's a let them eat cake scenario. And I think you're beginning to see people go, I'm not going to accept that.
No, Vusi, you're spot on. And I hate to say this, but it is that exact scenario that is being created, and I'll be blunt, it's being created by politicians. It's being created by politicians, as I often rail on the show. It's a very specific politician who enjoys the idea of effectively dividing a society based on, arbitrary things like race. I mean, that's always been our history to a large extent in this country. Race has always been the metric used to divide us, but we've now included other things in this democratic society where the politicians are quite wily in terms of saying, hey, how about you divide a society and create a society where it is us, the political elite, and not essentially the society that you accord opportunities, a society that you accord a solid education, safety and security, good healthcare, good education. It is a society that they rather say, no, we, the political elites, will be the deciders of who the winners and the losers are in society. And often it's done in a way in which, someone who isn't maybe paying attention might think, this might be a good thing, right? So, for instance, and I'll be controversial here, or controversial in terms of how people often look at me, but things like BEE, where you use race as a metric to advance and to empower people, on face value, and in terms of just the argument at face value, it sounds like a great idea. Why? Because you put two and two together. You say, well, historically it's been black folks who have been disenfranchised in this country, both economically and politically. Therefore, according to the argument, it stands to reason you ought to use race today to rectify that past. But the problem is, often people, when they accept that argument, they're judging a policy like BEE and what politicians say on the intentions and not necessarily the outcomes. And I would put it to you, and I think you're a stronger voice on this one than me, that someone like you who's actually in business would be better suited by making the argument of, hey, actually, does this policy see more people like me enter the space, or have we seen the opposite, where essentially there's fewer of us, and when I say us, I mean black South Africans who are enterprising, who want to start businesses, who want to build value in a society. Are there fewer of us in the society, and is that the real outcome of a policy like BEE? How would you respond to that?
I don't agree with you.
Okay.
I think black economic empowerment is very necessary. And in fact, I think what we should be doing is we should be accelerating it. There are parts of your argument that I agree with, but let me just make this point quickly, and then I'm happy for you and I to kind of thrash it out.
Yeah.
Let me also just say, by the way, that one of the things I enjoy, Sihle, which is why, I follow your work, and I follow many other people whose views are contrarian to yours. Mm-hmm. Is I think as South Africans, we need to get to a point where we can have debates that are sound and scientific, that don't necessarily have to rile up an emotion. Mm-hmm. So let me say this, right? Markets by themselves do not self-correct. So if you say to the market, we've had issues of structural inequality built into the system. So you come into a system, 94, 95, that is structural inequality built into it. You have to remember that if you look at ISCO, you look at which later became Kumba, you look at ESCOM, you look at any of those, SAA, there was a layer using job reservation, which was the law in apartheid, where you would have never found black people. So if you went into that system and said, well, leave the market to adjust itself, and I'm using state-owned enterprises, you can juxtapose that argument for the private sector as well. Mm-hmm. If you said leave the market to adjust itself, the market won't adjust itself. Markets don't do that. Markets and systems self-accelerate. That's why if you have a gardener, the first thing your gardener does when they see a weed is they pull it out, because weeds breed weeds. Systems self-accelerate. So if you have a system that is structurally imbalanced, it's not going to correct itself. You need to introduce distortions. So I think black economic empowerment is important as a market correction mechanism and as a distortion to the system. Where black economic empowerment lost a part of its path, and I say part because not completely, there have been great things done in it, but where it lost part of its path is when it was exploited and manipulated by people for a particular purpose and for a particular end. So for instance, Usihle, who now starts a business and happens to be a black entrepreneur, who should by law be given opportunities because he's black and comes from a position of disadvantage. He's now not afforded that opportunity because there is a much bigger business that partnered with a Vusi who's well known, but that transaction was done at a surface level, and it looks like black economic empowerment. So if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, must be one. And then it perpetuates this structure and system of exclusion. That's why you've had people over that period of time who have amassed incredible wealth. guys with bank accounts in Guernsey and Jersey and the Isle of Man, right? Who haven't built anything because the system was exploited. The reason I'm saying I don't agree with you is because I think what we need to do as South Africans is find out how do we adjust. It's a bit like you're in trial for a new vaccine. Let's use the coronavirus, right? So anytime they come up with vaccines, they're going to trial the vaccines until they get the one that works. And I think what we've been too slow to do is to trial the versions of economic empowerment that actually work. Right? So there was a time, for instance, when trusts were very popular. So companies went and did these share-based trusts. They became known as community-based trusts, and some were called ESOPs, employee share ownership schemes. And they created these trusts as a way of aggregating and amalgamating Black representation in those businesses. We also know that some of those trusts were then exploited because the trustees who were in service of the thousands of people who were beneficiaries of this trust, they got the Mercedes-Benz before the community had a road built. But I think it's one thing to say the system is exploited. It's quite another to say the system shouldn't exist. You clearly need a market distortion. If you don't have a market distortion, you're not going to correct the imbalance. Markets don't self-correct. Systems don't self-correct. But you also need to have a correction mechanism and a policing mechanism. South Africa's weakness, sorry, Sihla, and I'll close on this quickly, and then I want to hear your thoughts.
Sure.
South Africa's weakness isn't in legislation. It's not in policy. It's in policing and implementation. So when people break the law, like do stuff like fronting, what happens? Well, nobody goes to jail for it. And as a consequence, people perpetuate the cycle of breaking the law. And so you have to find a way of keeping people accountable and making sure that the law, the full might of the law, takes its course on people who break the law. You and I as South Africans have to agree that a commercial crime that seems to be just a rand-based crime has to be just as egregious as a gender-based violence crime. And we have to take both as offensive as South Africans to go, if you break this law, you're going to see just as much you're going to feel the might of the law just as much as you will if you break the other law. And unfortunately, we're not there yet. The organisms of state, the mechanisms of state, and most importantly, the speed at which the state moves, because it's so big, because it's so bloated, makes it so lethargic that it in itself can't police the very law that it has passed.
All right. There's two distinct points you made. One, which I disagree with, the first, and the second, which I actually agree with. The latter, on the issue of the rule of law and the idea of the state playing what is its role, which is to be effectively a referee, if you will, in a society. You know, the age-old principle of there being equality of all individuals before the law in a society, absolutely. It's a critical role in the state. And if you want to argue that there's been, if you want to argue one of the greatest failures, if you will, of the current administration and really historically in this country generally, it has been that exact principle. We have never treated South Africans, whether under the colonial era, apartheid, or even really today, with a requisite modicum of equality before the law. Why? It comes back to the first point I made, which is generally this is where the politicians have interfered by picking winners and losers in society on other arbitrary things which bypass the notion of equality. Let me be precise and specific and go back to the initial point I made around the dangers, therefore, of judging political action in distorting a market, as you put it, by the intentions and not the outcomes. In this country, if you want to talk about the market has actually always leaned towards what the society needs. Now, this sounds contentious because a lot of people think, how's that possible? Well, let's go back to the 1920s, 1927, 28 in particular. There was a massive strike in this country, bigger than Marikana. It also happened in the mining industry, where essentially white miners, white English-speaking miners, and then later Afrikaans-speaking miners, who joined into that, were feeling the threats of what was essentially the migrant labor system of black South Africans who were cheaper labor, yes, initially because they were unskilled, but after a while, because they worked on the job, they built up the skills over time, and they suddenly were able to do the things that the white echelons, if you will, of the workplace were supposedly the skilled individuals doing. You suddenly had a large proportion of black miners who were able to do those jobs, those skilled jobs, often at a slightly cheaper rate. That's what the market did. It essentially allowed for individuals with no skills to be able to enter a workplace, learn the on-the-job skills, slowly but surely raise their income after a time. And that became a threat in that society to often the imported white laborers, white skilled laborers who are working in the mines. What's the point of all of this? The strike that happened in 1928, the massive mine strike, which, by the way, saw the state intervene just as violently as we saw in Marikana. I mean, you literally had Jan Smuts back then, sending military planes shooting miners and dropping bombs on them. So when people say Marikana is the most violent, I'm like, no, go into history. Sorry, I digress. You literally saw a situation where the market was saying you have black South Africans who can just as easily do this job, who can just as, after a while with education and skills, be just as good as any white miner. You saw those white miners then saying, we'd rather organize and put pressure on politicians for the politicians to be the ones who choose the winners and losers and not the market, because the market was basically saying, in real terms, black South Africans able to do the job, give them the job, let them earn the salary. And then what happened after that? In 1929, the state then passes the Industrial Conciliation Act, the first real piece of legislation in the workplace, which was racially based on picking winners and losers and beginning to reserve jobs. Again, if you were a white individual back then, you would have loved that. Why? Because the state is picking the winners and losers, and it's doing so through political power, which you're seeing today. There are pockets of our society today who love the fact that the ANC government picks winners and losers. Again, it's all intentions. Picks winners and losers based on race, which is why I began with that argument around BEE. It picks the winners and losers based on race, even though the market is leaning in another direction, which is based on what the society needs and what is rational to the economy. Back then, black individuals who have the skills, who are in the industry, could take up those jobs, the higher paying jobs, and it didn't matter what their race was. It was about the individual who's able to do the job. So markets aren't always, as often people speak about them, this insidious force, that sort of leans on the side of injustice or whatever the case may be. In most cases, markets do exactly what a society wants. And it is often the interference by the state and politicians with their own agendas that distort that market, often for the detriment of a society. Because now suddenly, if I to just cap off the example, you now have a situation where artificially, through legislation, race-based legislation, you reserve jobs for people who the market in real terms and really businesses and business owners would have happily settled and had black individuals taking up leadership roles in the shafts of our mine. Now, that's one example, and it's quite an old one, but I wanted to use that one on purpose because, I wanted to argue that race-based legislation generally is part of the problems of what we've always experienced in this country, and they play themselves out because a lot of people judge them by their intentions, which are often noble. Don't get me wrong. I don't blame people for wanting a society where we give a hand up to people. That's often where people come from. People don't do it because they have some inherent evil agenda. No, of course not. There's often a very good intention behind it. And let me circle back therefore to BEE, because to a large extent it is that good intention which clouds us being able to evaluate the outcomes of that policy, where I would therefore put it to you, and it's part of, ironically, the rant you made, that good policy would have actually have meant that BEE becomes just EE, economic empowerment. We make the argument, why do I empower you? What is the basis of policy from me, the politician, into an environment of entrepreneurs, an environment of the workplace? I legislate empowerment based on need. So if you're a poor South African, regardless of race, like irrespective of whether you are, black or white, that's irrelevant. What I really am trying to fix is whether you are a poor South African, and how do I push you into that middle class strata, where I always describe, as being an individual who has a car in every garage and 2 chickens in every pot. Because that's very possible. We've seen societies around the world do this, and they've never had to resort to race to do this. We've always seen sorry, I got trapped by my own sentence construction there. We've always seen a situation, rather, where if you focus on that as a metric and policy rather orientating around that, in other words, helping poor people up and putting them into the middle class and growing income, growing wealth over time, that you have a far better outcomes as opposed to what we're seeing in this country, which is exemplified, ironically, as a last point, in the video you made, which is to say, it isn't just the lockdown that's done this, it has been 26 years of policy by these politicians who often we judge the intentions of, but we never evaluate the outcomes of. How would you respond to that?
I like your thinking. So I like the idea, and I'd never considered it before, actually, that rather than use race as a barometer, you use strata, economic. So you stratify the where you sit in the economic ladder, and you incentivize a progression up that economic ladder based on things that the individual themselves can input. See, I got to tell you, that's a very provocative idea, because your idea presupposes a society where individual liberty supersedes collective identity. And we're not that society. So you have to create that first as a way. If that you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
I mean, your name is literally Big Daddy Liberty. So you get what I'm saying? You'd need a society where people aspire for individual liberty and understand rights that are enshrined in the rule of law for them as citizens of a country. Understands that to which they are entitled, but more importantly, that which they must contribute, and what role the state will play, and where they have to meet the process, which would be way beyond halfway. It's not that way at the moment, and it won't be that way because that way doesn't win votes. So if you say to people, guys, if you are poor youth and you can quantify X number of things, these are the programs the state is going to have in place for you. I don't think that goes as far as saying if you are poor youth and then you add other dimensions which have been in the past. I like the idea. I mean, I think the idea is clearly very provocative. But, the thing about me is that I am open to ideas. I can tell you for free that idea would not make mainstream because that's not South Africans. We haven't yet developed the intellectual maturity to flex our minds into different directions where we hadn't flexed them before. The second thing I want to say is that idea would struggle to gain traction because you've had a deliberate dumbing down of the South African collective psyche, in particular, since, maybe 30 years, say, because we came out of an education system that didn't prepare us as citizens of the world. And then we went into a stratification of an education system, the private one, to which I imagine you, myself, I went to a Model C school, prepared you to be a citizen of the world, and the alternative did even worse than the system before. So you're now asking people who've not been trained to flex their minds, to begin to flex their minds and think about ideas that are so provocative. It's a lot easier to just sloganeer and to give people thoughts and to plant those thoughts and let people think that those thoughts are their own.
I would agree with you to an extent. The one area I sharply disagree is the nature and the characteristic of South Africans. South Africans aren't as dull as you're maybe suggesting they are. I think, if anything, the real problem we have in this country is the lack of political diversity in our politics, which then creates the impression for the average voter that this is it. This is all I have. And how do we know that this is the case? Look at the number of people in this country who are eligible to vote but do not vote. That tells the story of what is really happening. It's mostly a case of, and I'll add numbers just for context, there are 12 million South Africans in this country who are eligible to vote, registered to vote, but do not pitch up to an election to actually cast a vote. And compare that 12 million to what the ANC got in the last election, which is about 10 million voters. That tells you a strong story. That if those 12 million, for whatever reason, decided to come and vote on a given day, you could literally change the electoral map in this country like that in a single election. So what is the real issue, therefore? It's not that people are insipid or dull or they can't flex their intellectual muster, if you will, on these issues. I think, if anything, people are savvy enough to say, hang on, who am I as a South African? There's three broad characteristics of the South African. One, they're a God-fearing nation. We're a nation of faith, by and large. 97% Christian. That tells you everything you need to know. And we derive our values largely from that. Number two, we're a law-abiding society, by and large. Unless, of course, the traffic light is turning orange and you want to quickly beat that, then suddenly law goes out the window. And, of course, thirdly, we're a family society. By and large, we're a family society. It does not matter who you are in society. You could be the guy who pulls that trolley that puts recyclables and that forages through people's bins, and you're doing that for the benefit of your family. Equally, you can be a Fortune 500 employee, walking into the plushiest offices in Sandton, and you're equally doing what you're doing for your family. So that those three characteristics are actually the binding agent, and I don't think there's been any politician in real terms who's actually looked at the South African in the face and said, I recognize these three values, and therefore, as a binding agent, in other words, I can bypass things like race and identity politics and just focus on these values, and with these values say, how do I advance them? What are the ideas in a society that best advance your ability as an individual? And really, I talk a lot about individuals. Really, we're a family society. So how do we best advance you as your family with these ideas? And I put it to you as a last thought, because I want to circle back, and we're in our last sort of 10 minutes or so, or last 5 minutes, and I want to go to questions. I put it to you that it'll be the politician who taps into that raw vein that will not only be able to bring out the 12 million that I speak of, but also introduce these ideas that I speak of. For instance, we've never heard a politician say, hey, how about I dismantle the power over you that the state has and place those resources into your hands? On education, for example, how about I say you, the parent, decide? Instead of me telling you which school to go to, where invariably, if you, by the happenstance of history and the circumstances of your birth, if you're born in a neighborhood like where I'm from, Mlazi, and the schools in your area aren't the best, right now, you're obligated by and large, legally, but of course people disobey this, to go to those poorer performing schools. But what if I told you, this is the hypothetical politician I'm speaking of, that I can give you, the parent, the voucher. In other words, I can break down the education budget in this country, give it to you as a parent in a voucher. We've calculated about between 16 and 20,000 rand per child, per parent, depending on how you do the calculation. And you, dear parent, decide where you'd send your child to school. You mean to tell me, I want to get your view on this, that a parent looking at that liberty-leaning idea wouldn't understand it in their context without me having to go into the philosophy of being a classical liberal or libertarian? Do you mean to tell me that idea wouldn't resonate with that average South African that I described?
Of course it would. Of course it would. But I think, again, the idea is not bad. And it certainly doesn't lack provocation. But it has to land in a culture that is accepting of it. Right. So I suppose, in part when I talk about the collective dumbing down, I'm talking not only about the intellectual dumbing down, which, by the way, in my own view, I think has been deliberate, but that's a separate conversation for a different day. But I'm also talking about the cultural nuance dumbing down. So the reason an idea like that, which to me makes sense, I mean, I hear you, I'd like to think about it, but I hear the idea. The reason an idea like that would battle to gain traction in Leboahomu or in Unu or in Wattville, where I'm from, is because you would then be introducing a new culture of doing things. And to introduce a new culture of doing things, you need to make sure, as is the case with all scientific experiments, which this would be, by the way, that the environment that you're introducing that culture into is ready to accept that culture. Otherwise, it will reject it. So I'll give you an example. If there is a Model C school in the area in Nomlazi where you grew up, and that school that school at a point in time had 100% white kids in it, and the state introduced that system, I'm not sure that the school with 100% white kids in it would go, yeah, sure, just let the black kids in. And by the way, to the people watching this conversation, those who are parents and who are white, I wonder how many watch how many black kids in your school and then go, the school is going down. I'm just asking. I don't have an answer. I'm asking the question.
And I'll go to the comments. Yeah.
By the way, kind of make no mistake that it's true on the other side too. That there is also it's like an underbelly. It's like an undercurrent where there are some black people who the fewer the black people in anything, the better it is. It could be schooling, it could be private sector, jobs, anything, right? So what I'm saying is we need to deal. These ideas are not unattainable, but you need to deal with the mental culture of where South Africans are. The stuff that's been so taught and so entrenched and so embedded that people use it to adjudicate a situation unaware that they're using it as a filter. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's 100% true. And I can go into a bit of data on this, but I won't sink the conversation in that, except to maybe cite polling that's been done, for instance, by the Institute of Race Relations consistently since, even back in the apartheid days. And one of the questions on this one, which sharply disagrees with your view, is when people asked the question, for instance, on education, does the skin color of a parent or the skin color of the class in which you send your children really matter over the substance and the quality of what is produced in that school? 90+% of parents said absolutely not. We're more interested in making sure that our children, in other words, the very people who we care about, get a quality education, and the race of those individuals involved is irrelevant. And I think that speaks to, a sentiment which the average South African, and I'll let you in this now, the average South African is very attuned to, is very savvy, and that it's often us in the chattering class, if I'm to put it that way, who make these assumptions when in reality, most people are just looking out for enabling opportunities that look after for them and their families. How would you respond?
Yeah, I think you have to be careful of presupposing that all polling data is so sanitized that it lacks human, contamination. It's a bit like if you went to any white suburb and stood with a sign that says, please hoot if you voted for the apartheid government. No one's going to hoot at you. But the apartheid government didn't vote itself into power. And the idea that the people who did are all in Australia is just not true. So what I'm saying is you have to be careful of presupposing that the data doesn't have built into that data the human bias of often not wanting to admit our own prejudices. Listen, I don't have a problem with people having a prejudice. I have a problem with people pretending it doesn't exist, right? And I think that's a part of the problem in South Africa. Is we love to pretend these prejudices don't exist, which was my comment about if you leave the system the way it is, it won't correct itself. It's not going to do it because those prejudices are so ingrained, they're so inbuilt. The idea of certain races are lesser than others, less capable than others. If you grew up your entire life being taught that, being shown that, and believing that, then all of a sudden you're not one day going to just give free opportunities willy-nilly. You have to introduce a market distortion mechanism. So, and unless we admit those prejudices, it's hard for us to then say, how do we find a way of dealing with it without using the same method of prejudice to address it? I'm not averse to the idea of using a different method of prejudice to address a system distortion. But presuming that the data coming out of the system is not distorted is just not correct.
But then why do you presume that there is that distortion too? Are you not making the same mistake?
No. Well, you know that there is that distortion because you know that it's built into the system. I mean, it's say again?
Without sounding argumentative, how do you know that? I mean, surely, in other words, if I were to ask you to quantify that, what you call an inherent discrimination or an inherent prejudice, how do you, in a conversation, how do you quantify that for me?
I mean, I'll prove it to you. So here's a very simple case, right? So this is a very simple case. So how many people living in suburbs drive to townships for a doctor? And there are doctors in townships. Now notice I didn't use race, I use class. But it's the system. You're not going to leave a suburb and drive into a township for a doctor. Doesn't mean there aren't any there who are incredibly well versed at what they do and are very competent, but you're not going to do it. So, but the system is designed that way. Somebody built a township and somebody built a suburb. And they designed those two things the way they are.
Before we move on, I must press you though, because that's a little bit of a false equivalency. You made a distinct racial argument in arguing that there is an inherent prejudice, a deeply ingrained prejudice. Using a race one, therefore, is a bit odd because you can have the same question, for instance, and you said it yourself, a black individual who's now in a middle-class environment equally choosing not to go into a township to do this. That's not on the basis of race. But where we began this conversation is by you making the argument that it's actually a racial issue that is one stumbling block, for instance, a deeply ingrained prejudice, as you put it. Whereas I said, no, the polling shows the opposite. And that if anything, and ironically, your instincts went to where I was going to go. It's the class element, which is the most important, which ironically also circles back to the point I was making, that if we can accept that if it isn't race, based on the polling data and just generally, if you just observe people on the ground, if you can accept that race is no longer the predominant a predominant, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, because a lot of people sort of think I'm denying that there are still racists today. Of course there's still racists today, but on a structural level, it is not the race that gets in the way necessarily of an individual being able to pursue their own opportunity, or rather, being able to access opportunities and pursue their own interests, which is what you want in a society. It's actually really mostly class structures that ingrain that, which is why I argue that if you're going to then prescribe policy to address that, that the policy must address the class. In other words, for instance, circling back to my version of economic empowerment that looks at, do I help you because you're black or do I help you because you're poor? As a thought. But before you respond, I just want to quickly say we're running over time a little bit. I didn't want to keep you too long. So what I'm going to do is just for the audience say, guys, you're watching the Big Daddy Liberty Show. I am in conversation with Vusi Thembekwayo. Guys, I'm going to give it just 10 minutes because I must respect my guest time. I did say just 30 minutes. So can you just start firing up the questions and I'll pose them to Vusi in the next 8 minutes or so, and then we have to wrap up after that. So yeah, Vusi, what's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I hear you, but Sihle, you have to be careful not to presuppose that in a country like South Africa, class issues are class issues are so overlapped with race that it's not uncommon for people to see the one as an indicator of the other. In other words, statistically, it's more likely that if you are black, you're born a particular class than not. It's more likely. It doesn't mean it's definitely the case. It's just more likely. And it is more likely because of the demographics of this country. And those demographics, and I've made the point to you, are that way because, like all countries, the country was designed in that way. I'm not saying that you can't have an economic system or have an economic redress system that uses different barometers. I am saying that presupposing that the participants of that system don't hold particular prejudices would miss the point, because then you'll lose the opportunity to address what are naturally inbuilt prejudices, right? So yours and mine right now focuses very much on race. But if you cast your mind back to the US 1940s, 1950s that were based on gender, right? If you cast your mind to the world around the 1990s that were based on sexual orientation. And look, we're human beings. We're taught to see the world in a particular way. That you and I relate about ourselves based on our geography, our ethnicity, our tribe, or any of those things is precisely the socialization that we are taught. And I'm saying if you want to change the outcomes of a system, you have to understand that the inbuilt, often soft socialization is a part of the input into that system. It doesn't mean that people are so overtly racist that they would work against the system. That's not what it means. But it means that if you're not aware that people do harbor certain prejudices that often they themselves are unconscious of, then you're not going to have the mechanisms in the system to address those prejudices the minute they flare up and the minute they perpetuate themselves. Ergo, my example about, if you could, why don't you just drive to a township, right? Because if your argument about, let the market decide, I imagine a doctor trading out of the township is paying less rentals. It's also more likely that he's charging less money for a consultation. So why don't you? If the market decides, and we're purists about it, and the price at which you pay is the indicator rather than where the thing is, then we'd all go. But we don't all go, because we know that there are certain inbuilt prejudices. Well, why do you go to McDonald's and you don't go to the local general dealer and buy ikota? You'd pay 20% the price for 5 times the food. Why don't you? Because McDonald's has exploited those inbuilt prejudices and socializations. It's called marketing. They've taught you that it is better. And so you go there and you pay more and you feel good for paying more because that's what's socialized into you. Now, if I want to build the guy on the other side of the road who sells amakota and I don't understand that socialization, I'm going to come up with a system that's going to completely miss that. And if it misses that, then I'm not going to achieve what I wanted to achieve. And all that happens is you and I are going to lose time, which is in effect what's happened over the past 26 years, where you just lose time trying to achieve the thing. Whereas the outcome is actually more important, not necessarily the input.
All right, I'm going to go into questions. These often fly by, and this is a very popular stream tonight, so I might not be able to keep up with all the questions, guys. So just a quick reminder just to the viewers, guys, just type Big Daddy Liberty so that it gets highlighted so I can see the question. All right, let's see over here. So, question from Gareth H. No, I'm not going to read that question. Gareth, that's rude. Guys, if you want to disagree with a guest, please disagree, but you don't have to go into expletives and stuff. There's absolutely no need for that. Elizabeth Clark says, look, race is continuously touted by politicians. Just watch any ANC, EFF, or other party at their rallies. It's sad, and it keeps people divided and focused on the past instead of building a healthy present. Tim Hooper says it can also be a cultural thing. Many Muslims will go to a Muslim doctor. Doesn't make them anti-African. That's Tim Hooper. I'm going to know Nicholas Babaya is the final question. Does Vusi think that the kind of racial rhetoric which our politicians peddle is actually representative of how South Africans view race? Vus?
Ooh, that's a big question. Ooh. That's a bit of yes and no. I think that politicians found fertile ground when it comes to the issues of race in South Africa because it's South Africa, guys. Like, study our history, None of the politicians in power now invented the race dynamics as they exist. They inherited them, right? So they found fertile ground. I think what they did and continue to do is to amplify, is to aggravate, and is to agitate, because it gets the right behavior. It's an incentive-based system. If you're a politician, you want people to turn up at the ballot and put a cross next to your face. That's the linear programming that exists within our electoral system. And so it's much harder to get people to be as accepting about Sihle's very provocative ideas than it is to get them to be accepting of an idea that is simply based on, every time you look in the mirror, understand what we're talking about, right? So I think that they found it there, but I think that some of them, very successfully, by the way, have amplified it and have aggravated it and have used it to their own advantage. It's not uncommon. You see a politician who, I suppose because of where I sit sometimes in business, I know of these politicians' dealings in the boardrooms. And you see their dealings in the boardrooms, and then when you see them talking and you go, but that's not the same guy. That's not the same ideology. It's because they're playing to the gallery. There's my public speaking teacher used to say, playing to the gallery of comments. So you're playing to the gallery, and that's what you've got to do. And there's one thing you said, Sihle, which I have to amplify. The only way forward for South Africa is if we can find a way to decouple the conversation from what politicians have straddled that conversation on. That's going to be very, very difficult, because every time we try to create a new anchor, they're going to shift us back to the old anchor. And the old anchors are so deeply embedded now that it's going to be very hard to go, actually, we need to shift a new anchor to this. And I don't even know if that's something that's achievable in my lifetime.
Vusi, as we sort of go to the final 2 minutes, I want to just ask you maybe two more questions from the viewers. One was from, it's just flown past me. The ultimate sharpshooter. Shout out to you, brother. Welcome to the show. What is Vusi's solution to post-lockdown SA?
Ooh, post-lockdown SA? Yeah. You need to introduce far more aggressive competitive markets in the capital markets, not only around banks, but all around the capital markets. All the providers of capital, we need more competition so we can see more businesses being funded and more entrepreneurs building businesses. Let me tell you, Sihle, you deal with 90% of a society's problem by having a growing economy. 90% of the problem gets sorted when people have food on the table, right? So for me, that's almost where you've almost got to focus the attention. And that's the first thing you do. The second thing you do is you need to reduce the size of the state. It's too big, too bloated. That's what you got to do. I'm not even sure why we need provinces, but you got to do that. The third thing you got to do is to reduce the rate of intervention in the state, but increase the potency of those mechanisms. So you need fewer, in my mind, you need fewer summits, but you need more money in the ground committed to the things that were committed at the summits. Those are things, and then finally, this is the one for the South Africans actually who are watching this conversation, which is we need citizen activists. How many of us are citizen activists? I mean, we're in this conversation and then we go and we tweet and we Facebook and we speak at the bribe. But how many of us are actually embedded in the system doing stuff? I think that the future of South Africa lies in South Africans realizing the country's theirs and being citizen activists. So going to the nearest worst performing school and volunteering to be part of the governing body, right? Attending those council meetings, finding out who the councillor is and why is it that there's a pothole on, William Nicol or wherever you are. We need to be citizen activists. And I think we've outsourced our political responsibility for so long, we don't know how to take it back anymore. And if we don't do that, then I think post-lockdown South Africa is just going to perpetuate pre-lockdown South Africa.
Vusi, I did say just two more questions, or in this case, the final one. Kgopolang Lekoto, shout out to you, Kgopolang, welcome to the show. What are Vusi's thoughts on expropriation without compensation and things like the NHI?
You. So let's take a step back, right? What is the desired outcome? Because if we're clear on what the desired outcome is, then we can discuss what are the necessary mechanisms. So the NHI, my understanding, is that the desired outcome is a basic access to universal healthcare, right? If that is the outcome, then the first question we must ask ourselves is who are the people best positioned to be arbiters and administrators of that outcome? I'm not a rocket scientist, but if you look at the data, the people proposing the bill don't win that poll. So the real conversation isn't whether or not you need an NHI. The real conversation is, do you need a system of universal basic healthcare for all South Africans? And if the answer is yes, who are the people who are best proven and have the track record to administer that? Simple scientific conversation. And then you can come up with the answer, right? And I think for a lot more of the economic debates that we're having, we need to have those kind of scientific conversations in South Africa. And your question about land, here's the answer to the question about land. Look at the patterns of ownership. So first, if we agree that our economic system is based on land as a fundamental input to the asset for the individual, so you and I are talking about individual liberty. If we agree that in our economic system, access to ownership, and particular ownership of an asset, is a big part of how you participate in that economic system. And that the most basic asset in the system is land. And we agree in a system of individual liberty that every single South African should be given a fair shot. Then we shouldn't be politicizing the issue about ownership of land. Then we go, does South Africa have fair ownership? How do we achieve it? And then we ask ourselves the question, who are the people best in place to administer the system? I actually think a lot of these things, Sihle, lose their momentum because we don't have trust in the administrator. It's not necessarily that the idea is so fallacious or so egregious or so aggravating that we refuse to look at it. It's that we actually have an issue with the body that's in place to administer it. And as a consequence, we start fighting over ourselves about the policy and about what is the intended outcome. I'll just close by saying this. Mm-hmm. Every single person in this conversation, I promise you, wants to sleep at night and not lock their doors and know they'll be safe. They want their kids to go to the school nearest to home, be able to walk from home without suffering any incidences of crime, and to go to the best school there is. All of us want to live in a country where if you get hurt and you go to the local public hospital, you're going to get global quality healthcare. All of us. What divides us is the detail. And we're divided on the detail because we're focusing on protecting our own narrow privileges rather than try to widen the base and increase the level of delivery at the same time.
Yeah. Look, I won't say I understand your view completely. I think it would be nice if we had a bit more time on that, but we are at the tail end of this. But just maybe as a final pushback on my side, it'll be this. I think generally speaking, we live in a society where you're absolutely right. That is the desired goal of every single South African, is the ability to live in a property-owning, wealthy, non-racial, free and really prosperous society, one where we don't worry about these sort of things. And you're right. The first level of that equation is absolutely, in terms of the 3 or 4 suggestions you put forward, one has to limit the state, absolutely, and not only limit it, decentralize it and place it as close as possible to the man on the ground. In other words, there shouldn't, for me, echelons of government like the national government and the provincial government should be much smaller, and really it should be local governments that are empowered. And as you often mention, the right person in the right job. You cannot have things like cater deployment and that sort of nonsense, which is essentially politicians picking winners and losers. So I fully agree on that. Where I disagree is...
By the way, I love that idea. I love the idea. Sorry, I want to amplify it.
Sure.
I love the idea about the centralization of the choice of winners and losers. Because if you don't create a merit-based system, sooner or later you disincentivize talent.
Absolutely.
And you disincentivize merit. And then there's an aggregation, a vortex down to the worst amongst us. I love that idea, and I think you got to find a way of amplifying that idea.
And maybe let me speak to that because, I don't know if you know it, but on the issue of citizen activism, Vusi, you're 100% correct. You cannot expect that the same politicians who have led us down the path that we're on right now will suddenly be the same politicians who will fix that, or worse yet, will be the same politicians that suddenly incentivize the 12 million I spoke of, who are eligible to vote but don't vote because they look at the sheer lack of diversity in our politics and they say, not for me. You've got to have citizen activism in that regard. Part of the work I'm doing, Vusi, is not just, this show and, the tweeting and all that stuff, but I'm literally hitting the road of this country, taking to the streets, so to speak, traveling across the country, advocating for these ideas and more around how you build that property-owning, prosperous, non-racial free society. So, keep an eye on that, brother. I love I'd love your thoughts on when I start doing this work. And I must thank you, Vusi, for even coming on to the show, especially for going over time a little bit. And thank you, dear viewers. Vusi, maybe as a final thought, how do the people reach you on social media if you want to be found?
Yeah, so at Vusi Thembekwayo on all of my social medias. I love conversations like this. I love ideating. I love thinking. I love expanding our minds. And so anybody who wants to engage with me on new ways of thinking and provocative ideas, I'm happy to do it. If you have an agenda, then you'll just find that I generally don't have time for that. People are trying to perpetuate their own self-interest. But Sihle, I would love to see how I can help you and amplify the things you're doing in terms of hitting the ground. Because there has to be a recognition that the people who are in the positions they are in are not going to give us the future that we want. And so it's clearly up to people like you, me, and every other person in this conversation to become a part of that solution. So if there's anything I can help to help you achieve what you want to do, please hit me up and I'd love to chat.
Absolutely. Super appreciate that. And super appreciate you, Vusi, for being on the show. Thank you so much, brother. And a blessed evening to you. And thank you so much.
Cheers, Squire.
All right, guys, that was Vusi Thembekwayo, the business mogul and really global speaker. Excellent guy, good to speak to. Lots of stuff that I disagree with, of course. I think, we need to keep our eye on the ball when it comes to issues of building that sort of society, that ideal society I speak of, where most South Africans are middle class. But I think Vusi does add an important dimension in terms of looking at this issue from the lens of the business world. And it's up to people like me and other people who are liberty advocates to then inject that volume of ideas into society in order to change it. As you could hear in the conversation, there were certain ideas that Vusi hadn't thought of, heard them, and absolutely loved them, or not loved them, really said, hey, I like the idea of that. I would want to hear more. And I'm putting it to you as the viewer that the vast majority of South Africans, and this is where I disagree with Vusi, the vast majority of South Africans are open to these ideas, but they've never heard them out in our politics because of the lack of diversity that I often speak about. So, yeah, guys, a big shout out to Vusi for even joining me on the show. And thank you very much. Let me wrap the show up over here with just reminding you guys that, guys, I will be hitting... Oh, excuse me. There comes that kombucha. I will be hitting the streets of South Africa relatively soon. I have hit a little bit of a snag. I was going to start my trip this Friday, Sunday, but I have hit a bit of a snag, a bit of a family crisis. But I will devote a vlog or an episode to detailing the full plan and exactly when I hit the road, so that people who might be on the route of where I head to as I do the first leg of the Liberty Bus Tour, which is from Johannesburg to Cape Town. And by the looks of it, if I can just put you into the loop, that route will initially take me via the Northwest, the North Cape, and then down to the Western Cape. I'll do the other provinces in subsequent legs of the journey. So I will fully detail that plan, including when I now finally take to the road, either close to the end of this week or next week. But by the looks of it, I'm only going to now begin the trek, the Liberty Bus Tour at the end of this month, because there's quite a lot of things I now need to wrap up in this part of the world. But with that being said, we'll cross that bridge in another episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Big Daddy Liberty Show. I'm going to hope that I have more people on the show who actually even just disagree with me, so we can have that debate here on the show and we can actually test these ideas against our detractors. So that'll be a super nice one. Guys, remember, you can support the BDL Show by becoming a Patreon subscriber. As little as $1 a month, 17 Rand a month does the job of building a mass of South Africans who donate to the show and to the cause, especially as I begin to then hit the road. Guys, thank you for watching the show. I'm just keeping an eye on the comments. I often sometimes forget to do this. Thank you so much to all the guys who asked questions. Khupulang, thanks, brother. I appreciate you for watching. Marcel, I see you. Marcel says, as long as he is for smaller government and a free market, I don't care about what the other views we might disagree with. Yeah, like I think broadly speaking, you know, you're on the mark. But remember, as I always say, ideas matter, and that we're in the battle of ideas. So it's super important to make sure that you win people continuously, because you've got to consistently do the work. You win people on the ideas. Otherwise, you'll find yourself literally losing and ceding territory to your opponents. A good example, for example, was the ANC under Mbeki, which was more market friendly, and we actually saw growth in this country, 5% plus year on year. What happened when he lost the battle of ideas in the party? The commies came back, riding the wave of a populist Jacob Zuma, and we've had absolute misery because of that. So the battle of ideas is also critically important. You've got to keep waging it. Jenny Quinn says, I liked Angry Vusi better. This one is too smooth and uses vernacular that doesn't really make sense. I kind of agree with that to an extent. I think there was a little bit of waffle on Vusi's part. But I also kind of understand that, right? Often people resort to the rhetoric that they know, and sometimes when you throw a new idea at someone, there's that little first few seconds of cognitive dissonance where you kind of go, ooh, new idea. I don't know how to engage this idea outside of my usual talking points. And I'm not saying that's what necessarily Vusi was doing, but there were instances where I could clearly see that that's what he was doing. And I'd often want a longer show in order to vacillate these issues out and to break it down. So I am eternally grateful that he says he's a fan of the show and that he watches the content. And what we'll start doing is doing these short sound bitey type videos that unpack my ideas in a very practical sense. So that when I make the argument that when you talk about policy and liberty-leaning policy, and when you compare it to current policy and the race-based, lefty, pro-government, pro-politician type policy, you'll understand when I say you need to judge them not on their intention, but on their outcomes. So you can look forward to those sort of shorter, soundbitey type videos where I maybe take an issue and break it down in a 5-minute video, a bit of a monologue around what this issue is, how we fix it, and how a liberty-orientated idea actually addresses that issue. So thanks for that, Jenny Quinn, that you've just given me that idea to do that. And I might even partner with some organizations that do this kind of work. And again, thank you to those of you who are Patreon subscribers and who are actually beginning to fund the show, because now I can actually afford to hire people who have greater expertise than me, guys who can help me with editing and that sort of thing. So we can do these more creative videos and I can improve the quality of my channel. So please, 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 guys, tell your friends, support the show. The more I grow, the more I want to create a media conglomerate. Wow, jeepers, I'm already talking about conglomerates. There's my entrepreneurial streak coming out. But absolutely, to create a media house, if you will, for people, for not only BDL, but also other South Africans who hold liberty ideas. So I definitely have that in the horizon. Let's see if I can just tackle maybe just 2 more questions. And then I'll call it a night. Maybe let me call it tonight at 9:30. So 5 more minutes. Olive LG, thank you so much. I've been seeing your icon pop up here. Mwah, thank you so much. Welcome to the show. BDL, we're with you, bro. All of us. If I actually had money, loose man, supporting you now after this thing. This guy was racist. Yeah, look, firstly, thank you. Like, guys, you don't have to feel pressured to support the show financially. If you're not in a position to, that's totally fine. The fact that you're watching and you're sharing the show is super, super important too. Look, I don't think Vusi is a racist. I wouldn't go that far because, you know, if I were to make that point, I'll be comparing him to someone who I often do call a racist, for example, like Julius Malema, who has the malice in him and the intent to be racist. I think there are some South Africans who, because a race-based way of looking at things is how they were taught, they don't think beyond that necessarily, and they don't necessarily explore easily and readily. They can when you then push them, but I don't think they readily and easily in how they quickly frame issues think beyond the racial prism that we've created, because that's what happens, as I said, as I was making the comment earlier on, when you cede your ground to your ideological opponents. Our ideological opponents in this country mobilize on the basis of identity. They mobilize on identity politics, so that race, gender, and class these are the things that they rally and push their ideas out through the prism of. And because they dominate the mainstream media, because they dominate our politics, because they dominate, as I said to Vusi, the chattering classes in this country, they create a faux reality that everything in South Africa is viewed through the issue of race, and they even dispute then when you give them hard data about the true nature of South Africans. They dispute it because they just don't know how to then reframe what they've been taught. So it's not an issue of them being racist necessarily. People revert to what they know, and people often struggle to think beyond that box. That's why it is important to prosecute the battle of ideas, for people like me to inject an even greater volume of my ideas in society with the view of changing it. That's the whole battle of ideas theory that I operate on. So I wouldn't really say Vusi Thembekwayo is a racist. I don't think he is. I think, like most people in the established, very sort of chattering classy types, the people who write into newspapers, the people who get opportunities to talk in the mainstream media, I think they're just ingrained in a certain subset of ideas that are rooted in identity politics. And really, if you look at from an academic lens, if I can put my academic specs on, it's also rooted in postmodernist ideas and cultural Marxism to a large extent, but it's masked through the lens of viewing things through identity. So again, I just had to throw that out there because a lot of people perceived what he was saying as him trying to be racist, and I don't think that's the case. You've got to understand the rhetoric of your opponents. You've got to, not to say that Vusi is an opponent, but the ideas he was often pushing out, I could hear them and their genesis from the people who often are my ideological opponents. So we just need to be careful about that kind of stuff, guys. And again, I must come back to a comment I saw earlier on, and I sort of like just nipped it in the bud. Guys, you don't have to be mean. Like on my show, that's not what I do. Like, if you disagree with the guest, pop a genuine question to him and I'll ask it to the guest. But we don't need to be, maligning people's characters. And guys, I don't do that. I'm sorry, it's not in my character. When I say to you that I genuinely love South Africans, even the ones that I disagree with, I genuinely love you guys. And I don't make it my business to be necessarily mean and, guys, I don't operate like that. I'm sorry. And I struggle therefore to even transmit, it may have been an innocent question, but I struggle to transmit it to a guest when that I'm just not on that energy level. So I just thought I should raise that, and I'm sorry if I was terse in my response in the moment, but I couldn't, just segue away from the interview in order to address that. All right, guys, I'm a minute away, so maybe just one more question. Khupulang says he was definitely an opponent. Look, I agree, partially, even though I'm contradicting what I just said now. I think he was a conduit for the rhetoric of what my opponents often talk about. And that's what happens when you cede ground, as I said. And I don't want to repeat myself like a broken record, but it then presents people who are actually quite reasonable as looking like your opponents when in reality they aren't. And that my job is, and what your job is, Hupulang, is it's for us to inject even a greater volume of ideas, to change people, to give them a better basket of ideas that they can trade on in order to change society. Melanie Todd, perhaps not racist, but arrogant, maybe. I wish I'd seen that. I would have put it to him on the stream, Anyway, guys, I must wrap up and say thank you once again to every single one of you. Yeah, thank you so much to every single one of you guys. Sorry for running over time. I usually... Oh my goodness. I'm sure the coronavirus is looking at me on like, yeah, that's right. That's what I wanted to hear. Guys, thank you so much for watching the BDL show. Remember, the Big Daddy Liberty show every Wednesdays, 8 p.m. And of course, my other show, Late Nights with Big Daddy Liberty, on a Sunday at 9 p.m. Look out for it. I'm going to start alternating the Big Daddy Liberty show with my other show that I haven't done in a while called Blacks Only. And that's me being purposefully cheeky to the identity merchants by calling my show Blacks Only. By actually showing that, Black South Africans don't think alike. There's no such thing as oh wow, now I'm forgetting what I wanted to put in there. That there's no such thing as a uniform or the same black people. We're actually intellectually diverse. And that's the only diversity that matters, and not racial diversity. So look out for that. I will be alternating between the BDL show and Blacks Only on a Wednesday evening at 8. And with that being said, let me thank every single one of you for having joined me on the show. And as always, how I end the show is for you to never trust a commie